All right, welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving headfirst into a film that completely blindsided audiences back in May of 2026. We are looking at Speed Demon. It's this incredibly intense, independent, supernatural horror thriller that somehow perfectly merges the claustrophobia of a disaster movie with the chilling, under-your-skin terror of demonic possession. If you're fascinated by how a movie can balance gritty, old-school practical effects with deeply character-driven horror, you are absolutely going to love this. Today we're focusing specifically on the film's gripping plot, and we'll break down exactly how the narrative builds this insane tension from the very first frame to the final, heart-stopping climax.
Okay, let's dive into this with a quote from Peter Martin over at Screen Anarchy that literally hits the nail on the head. The Exorcist on a bullet train. I mean, come on, does it get any more explosive than that? It perfectly captures the wild, high-concept premise we're dealing with today. We aren't in some quiet, dusty old house or a secluded cabin in the woods. Nope, we are trapped in a confined, high-speed metal tube hurtling down the tracks at 100 miles an hour with literally nowhere to run. It's a real game-changer of a setup for a thriller, mostly because it takes that traditional slow-burn exorcism trope and injects it with an immediate ticking clock adrenaline rush.
Now, to make a wild plot like this actually work, you need a cast that can ground all that chaos in real, relatable human emotion. The film is completely anchored by Cassidy playing Sister Lou, alongside the legendary William H. Macy, who steps into the role of the seasoned Father Novak. Also absolutely crucial to our plot is Onika Day as Madam Secretary, who, as you'll see, becomes a very important puzzle piece a little later on. And what's especially cool here is that Cassidy wasn't just leading the charge on screen, she was a massive driving force behind the scenes as well, serving as a main producer. She teamed up with director Jon Keeyes, you might know him from his work on the thriller Cult Killer, and together they crafted this independent genre film that relies on sheer talent and practical effects rather than some bloated CGI budget.
Let's get right into Section 1, Ticket to Hell, The Burden of Sister Lou. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is comparing where our protagonist starts versus where she ends up. Our story kicks off on a seemingly routine, high-speed train traveling from Montreal down to New York. But the real journey here is completely internal for Sister Lou. She starts out as this rebellious, doubting novice nun. She's just witnessed the tragic death of her mentor during a horribly botched exorcism. She's broken, her faith is completely shattered, and she's on the verge of walking away from the church for good. The Vatican actually assigns her to accompany Father Novak on this specific trip, hoping it's going to restore her confidence. Contrast that starting point with her ultimate destination, becoming a fiercely independent, Vatican-recognized exorcist with fully renewed faith. The entire plot of this movie is essentially the brutal, terrifying crucible she has to survive to get to that endpoint.
Which brings us to Section 2, Boarding the Cursed Train, the Demonic Outbreak.
Once those train doors close, the nightmare officially begins, with our antagonist, Asmodeus. Now, this isn't just your run-of-the-mill evil spirit. The plot introduces an ancient entity with a very specific, highly contagious methodology. It starts when a single passenger unknowingly releases the demon. But Asmodeus doesn't just stay put in one person. It possesses someone and then rapidly spreads from victim to victim. And here's the truly terrifying hook to this whole plot. The demon actively feeds on fear and despair to strengthen its influence. Because of this escalating panic within the claustrophobic train cars, Father Novak's conventional by-the-book exorcism methods become increasingly useless. The old rules simply do not apply when the demon is getting supercharged by the sheer terror of all these trapped passengers.
And things go from bad to worse so fast. Let's walk through the timeline because the claustrophobia and the stakes multiply with every single minute. At 0 minutes, the entity is released in secret. A mere 30 minutes later, it is rapidly jumping hosts, and the supernatural events are totally consuming each carriage. By the 60-minute mark, the situation spirals into a full-blown physical disaster. The entire train crew is completely incapacitated. There's literally nobody at the wheel. And at 90 minutes, the train is accelerating completely out of control. Father Novak and Sister Lou aren't just fighting a spiritual battle anymore. They are physically fighting their way through this train, trying to rescue survivors while hurtling toward a catastrophic derailment. And this brilliantly illustrates the horrifying twist in the plot. As our heroes are battling through the train cars, they realize this isn't just random mindless chaos. Asmodeus actually has a master plan. The target? A powerful political figure traveling on board, Madam Secretary. So the demon's rampage is essentially a targeted supernatural assassination. Novak and Lou try their best to isolate the possessed passengers to stop the spread, but they're met with incredibly violent physical resistance from the hosts.
It's a fantastic narrative layer that takes the plot from a simple monster movie and elevates it into a high-stakes conspiracy. All right, let's move into Section 3, the final exorcism, showdown in the locomotive. Let's move to the climax and see how this builds, because the tension here reaches an absolute boiling point. Father Novak, doing literally everything he can to protect the terrified surviving passengers, gets severely wounded. So the seasoned veteran is down, the train is still speeding toward disaster, and the entire burden falls squarely on Sister Lou. She has to confront this ancient evil entirely alone. Step 1. Guided by Novak's teachings and finally finding her renewed faith, she begins the full exorcism in the locomotive all by herself. Step 2. Her sheer willpower and faith cause the ritual to temporarily weaken Asmodeus. But here is the most incredible payoff to the plot. Step 3. She doesn't actually finish it alone. The surviving passengers, the exact same people who were paralyzed by fear just an hour ago, step up and physically separate the demonic host from the entity while it's weakened. It is this amazing, gritty merging of spiritual warfare and physical teamwork. And finally, we get that massive breath of relief. Asmodeus is ultimately banished. With the supernatural grip on the train totally broken, the emergency systems are able to re-engage, and a catastrophic derailment is narrowly avoided. The passengers are saved. It's a profoundly satisfying conclusion to the immediate physical threat. And of course, it marks the successful completion of Sister Lou's very first independent exorcism. Moving right along to our final part, Section 4, Aftermath and Reception. The critics weigh in. So the crucial point is how audiences in the real world actually reacted to this. Released simultaneously in theaters and on digital platforms in May of 2026, this independent, practical effects-heavy film was a really fascinating test case for genre fans. And it succeeded. It secured a respectable 70% positive consensus on Rotten Tomatoes from early critic reviews. For a B-movie setup like An Exorcism on a Train, getting a solid fresh rating is a huge win. It just shows that director Jon Keeyes and the producing team delivered exactly the kind of soundly entertaining thrill ride they promised, leaning heavy into the practical demon effects and those character-driven stakes we just analyzed. Of course, a premise this out there is bound to be a bit polarizing among critics, right? Peter Martin at Screen Anarchy gave it a 3 out of 5, noting that Cassidy was convincingly effective and brought considerable grace to a role that honestly could have easily been laughable in the wrong hands. Nathaniel Muir at AIPT genuinely enjoyed the expansive world-building, and he specifically praised a very powerful epilogue that we're going to touch on in just a second. On the other side of the aisle, Matt Donato at Daily Dead gave it a 1.5 out of 5, brutally calling it a one-way ticket to Sleepytown, completely rejecting the fast-paced action that the other critics enjoyed. Hey, it just goes to show horror is always incredibly subjective. But wait, for those who stuck around for the credits, the plot had one last massive reveal. The mid-credit scene shows Vatican officials investigating the train incident, and they find evidence that this demonic outbreak targeting a political figure was just one small piece of a much larger supernatural conspiracy. It hints at the secret group, perhaps even controlled by factions within the Vatican itself, steering these battles between the church and the forces of evil. Which leaves us with a pretty thrilling question to end our explainer today. Who is truly behind the church's supernatural battles? Is the greatest evil coming from hell, or is it pulling the strings right from within the halls of power? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Speed Demon, and keep learning.